Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. There's been yet another mass shooting in the United States of America, and this time it's quote-unquote different because while the shooter posted a manifesto, and no, we're not really going to talk about that in detail, but it kind of just does the whole typical right-wing neo-Nazi bullcrap. And what's different about it this time is that the shooter was Latin American or Mexican American or Hispanic American, all sorts of terms to try and point out, hey, he's not white, so how could he be a neo-Nazi if not white? Checkmate, leftists. So today, as a Latino, it's time for me to unfortunately inform everyone about how racist the subcontinent is. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So apparently it needs to be said, yes, Latin Americans can be white supremacists. There are a ton of white Latin American people. In fact, there are several countries that are majority white in Latin America. Uruguay, Argentina, Costa Rica, and Chile and Cuba are all majority white. And without even looking there, just a casual look at America also reveals that you have very racist, practically Nazi and all but name people who also happen to be of Latin American descent. Nick Fuentes' father is Mexican American. Ted Cruz is an American Cuban, sometimes known as a Gusano. One of the most famous leaders of the Proud Boys is Enrique Tarrio. He's also Latin American. All three of these little awful ghouls have Latin American heritage, and two of them are definitely white passing, but all of them definitely have white supremacist neo-Nazi vibes to them. I also remind people that the Americas were first of all colonized by the Portuguese and the Spanish, who are European and thus brought the ideas of European race and religion and civilization to the Americas and inflicted all those unspeakable horrors upon my indigenous ancestors. And my black ancestors too, for that matter. So since we're talking about race and civilization, air quotes, in Latin America, let's talk about the casta real quick. If you've heard the term mestizo or mulatto, you are already at least somewhat familiar with the casta. The casta was a racial and social identifier used by the Spanish to determine someone's lot and worth in life, basically. There were all kinds of terms for socially identifying who was actually who on the ladder. So, if you're half black and half white, this is what you are, and that's where you fall on that social ladder, as a very brief example. At the absolute top, however, you had peninsulares and criollos. Now, peninsulares were white people who were actually born in Spain and then came over to, wreak hegemony on America. And then criollos were white people who were born in the New World. That's right. Shit was so white and so prejudiced that they had to make two different distinctions for the types of white people. And the peninsulares were seen as better and the criollos as inferior. Like, oh my God. And so these privileged few, these peninsulares and criollos, they start, setting up what would become the foundations of all the different Latin American states by displacing and or murdering indigenous people and also, by the way, enslaving them. What ends up happening is you have various different systems. The encomienda, which dealt with a lot of slavery and how they were entitled to certain groups of people and their labor, like what the actual hell? And then you also had systems like the hacienda and the latifundia. Now, the latifundia was basically you would be given like a large landed estate to which you were entitled all the monetary rewards thereof. These were given to churches. These were given to like wealthy aristocrats from Spain or from Portugal. And the hacienda was kind of at the center of all that, where it was like your big estate slash a factory. That's part of where hacienda comes from. It comes from the Spanish verb hacer, meaning to make or create. And so that was sort of the center of all of this of, yes, here on my massive slave plantation that stretches out to the horizon as far as the eye can see, and all these slaves, the indigenous ones keep dying, so I guess we better get the transatlantic slave trade started. Come on over here, Africans, we gotta work you to death so I can just sit here on my porch, on my hacienda, while everyone's making stuff so I can get richer and richer. This happened pretty much everywhere. Now, there were some places that didn't have as much slavery, but this was basically everywhere from Mexico to Brazil and everywhere in between. So this is all at the very beginning of Latin American history, right? And already you are seeing massive amounts of inequality, racial prejudice, slavery, and all the wealth being concentrated into the hands of a handful of white people who decided from the get-go, by the way, to implement this casta system of racial stratification while they were again abusing and enslaving and extracting wealth from the land and the people that were either indigenous to there or brought over as slaves from Africa. So yeah, the legacy of all of this is a continent that speaks Spanish, is predominantly Catholic, and is overwhelmingly racist. Far too many conflicts to count from Latin America have been started due to a power struggle, either between criollos or the landed criollo estate class versus the majority, either mestizo or indigenous or some other marginalized population that rose up in rebellion saying, hey, you're talking about this democracy and representation stuff. Can we get some of that? And then the criollos would basically say, no, go to hell. Think about the recent coup in Peru and how that was meant to protect the landed interests in Peru, or even the one that came before that in Bolivia with Janine Áñez and a selection of a handful of white Bolivians who just said, oh no, these poor indigenous Bolivians, they don't know how to run things, so we gotta take over and show them how it's really done. This is not an uncommon part of Latin American history. In fact, there's a term for what it means to actually improve the country: blanqueamiento. Blanqueamiento is literally the idea of whitening your people and your nation. See, we're getting more and more white and therefore more and more civilized, because that's what our ancient slave master Spaniards and Portuguese people imprinted in our subconscious. You don't have to look far or hard to find racist Latin Americans or Hispanic Americans. Whether they are born and raised in the United States or they are found elsewhere throughout Latin America, it doesn't really matter. You can find this easily. I feel like I'm just kind of in this weird space of, oh yeah, I'm perfectly aware of all this, and people are suddenly shocked to be like, oh no, it's impossible for brown people to be racist. And it's that's because not all Latin Americans are brown people, and that's part of why we have a huge race and colorism problem in the Latin American community. As a grim example, my father is Afro-Latino. Technically, he's a Zombo, see the Costa for that. But he's as Latin American as just about anyone, and yet, because of his skin color, he is greeted with racism by a great many other Latinos. We should also maybe talk a little bit about the Dominican Republic and their whole relationship with race, but I'm not Dominican and I couldn't get my Dominican friends to immediately respond before I started recording this. So that's probably going to have to be a subsection for a different time, but it's definitely very weird and very sus. As a starter of getting your feet wet into this subject, Foreign Man in a Foreign Land released a pretty good video that touches on the Dominican view of race and how they view Haitians and Blackness. So you should definitely go check that video out if you haven't already. But I am just so flabbergasted and exhausted by this notion that, oh no, this mass murder couldn't possibly have been a neo-Nazi because, see, he's Latin American or Mexican American or some kind of identifier that in my mind I think means non-white. There can't possibly be neo-Nazis in such a diverse place like Brazil, and it's yeah, actually there are. There are absolutely white supremacist Latin Americans in Latin America and in the United States. You're probably, again, as I mentioned near the top of this video, you're probably familiar with at least one or two of them. This is not uncommon, and all this really is at the end of the day is the right wing trying very hard to distance themselves and their awful, racist, bigoted ideology and trying to put it on, it's that kind of excuse of, no, see, I can't be racist towards black people. Here's my one black friend. It's just really weird and awful tokenization. And unfortunately, that's the emerging narrative, and people are still shocked to find out that there are white supremacist Latin Americans. All that is definitely what's bothering me today.